Well, for everybody who's on, welcome to the Heart of the Coach. My name is Brian McKenzie, serve as the Director of Football for the Fellowship of Christian Athletes in the Midwest region, and this is our 7th edition of the Heart of the Coach. And what we want to do through these Zoom calls is to encourage and equip you as football coaches. And we do that through having a guest. And today we're honored to have our guest coach be Tom Osborne. He coached at University of Nebraska for many years and is in the Hall of Fame. And we don't have to give all his accolades and those kind of things. Most people know that. So, Coach, welcome to the Heart of the Coach today.
Well, thank you, Brian. It's good to be on.
Good. Well, Coach, just to kind of start off with a football question here, a lot of the coaches like to hear these kind of things. What's the greatest football game you've ever been a part of, and why was it so great?
Oh, golly, I've been part of a lot of them, but of course, one of them that gets a lot of attention was the Nebraska-Oklahoma game, 1971. I was an offensive coordinator in that game. Bob Devaney was the head coach. And we were rated number 1. I think Oklahoma was rated number 2. And it ended up 35-31. And so some people have called it the game of the century. And then, of course, we had a game with Miami where we went for 2 points and didn't make it. And some people say, well, you're dumber than heck. You should have kicked the extra point and tied them. But I remembered my thoughts when a team had settled for the tie a couple years before and kind of backed into the national championship. And I thought, well, yeah, if you're going to win a national championship, better win the game. And so but there were a lot of them. And but sometimes that's been a while ago, so memories go dim.
I remember the Miami game definitely, and I definitely thought you should have gone for 2. It was a good call, Coach, and just didn't work out. Well, Coach, why is coaching in this day and age so important?
Well, I think the main thing I think most everybody here realizes that the biggest change that I saw over 36 years of coaching was the breakdown of the family. And when we went out to recruit young men back in the early 60s, very seldom you ran across a young guy that wasn't growing up under the same roof with both biological parents. And as time went on, that began to change. And today, over half of our young people are growing up without both biological parents. Roughly 26 million are fatherless. And so I think the influence of the coach beyond the field is greater than it ever has been, because in many cases, for a lot of these young guys, the only adult role model that's probably most impactful in their life is their coach. And this is not universally true, but I'd say with a high percentage of our young men, that's the case. So you guys have probably today more impact than ever. And there's a lot more stresses on you. I think social media has made it harder. People say things on social media that they would never say to your face because it's somewhat anonymous and impersonal. And so you live with criticism. I think at one time, when a coach said something, it was pretty much accepted as the way it was, and now it's questioned. And quite often, if a young man is unhappy, the parents will take the side of the young man. And it used to be they would more take the side of the coach or the person in authority. So a lot of stresses on you today. And those grew and changed over time.
Yeah, I agree with you there for sure, Coach. It's so important, even more so than now. You're so right. Used to, when the coach said, get on the bus, everybody got on the bus with no question. And now there's a lot more questioning just because of the background the kids were coaching come up in. So, Coach, why is FCA so important? Why is it so important to you? What have you seen in your own life why FCA is so important?
Well, I guess I owe a personal debt to FCA. As a young person, I grew up in a Christian home, and I guess I was sort of a Christian by birth and inheritance. My grandfather actually was a minister, and World War II came along, and my dad left, and when he came home after 5 years, he was pretty much a stranger to me. He left when I was 4, came home when I had 9, and I threw myself into athletics because I wanted to please him. He liked athletics, and so I played them all: football, baseball, basketball, ran track, and that's pretty much my whole life. And so probably a little bit of a neurotic twinge to it. It wasn't. I enjoyed athletics and I loved athletics, but also some of it was a case of having to be good, and not so much a case of just wanting to be good, because I felt like if I was good enough, people would approve of me. And maybe because of some of those things that happened during World War II, I didn't approve of myself a whole lot. And so I was trying to get approval through athletics. And so back in 1957, I went to a FCA conference, second year they ever had FCA conferences out in Estes Park. And during that time, I heard Christianity articulated in a way by people I could relate to and whom I admired in a way that I had not heard before. And I remember during that week sometime I read a verse of scripture. It's in Matthew that really impacted me. And Jesus was talking and he said this: whoever would come after me must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And that, for some reason, impacted me because at that point I saw the challenge of this whole thing, that this wasn't a casual decision, because he was talking about a cross. And he knew what the cross meant by seeing those people who were crucified by the Romans by the wayside. And he knew, I guess, intuitively that someday that was going to be his fate. And so what he was asking you to do is to be obedient unto death. And so I decided, this is what I'm going to do. And so I've never turned back from that decision. I was 20 years old at the time. Mm. And then the verse scripture went on to say something like this. It said, if any man would save his life, he will lose it. And if any man lose his life for my sake, he will find it. And I guess as I kind of inspected my life, I realized that I was trying to save my life primarily through being a good athlete. And so I think what Jesus was saying to me, at least at that time, was whatever's first in your life, whatever's most important, whatever occupies most of your time, your talent, your resources, is your bet as to how you're going to save your life. And for me, it was athletics. And so I realized that it's kind of a dead end, because you can only run and jump so long, and eventually you're no longer going to be an athlete. And I guess you guys can plug in the gaps. I think for coaches, quite often we try to save our lives through the win-loss record. And certainly if you don't win enough, you're not going to be employed. And it's really a struggle. But what Jesus was saying is that following me and serving me and honoring me with what you have is the only thing that's permanent. Mm. And I think that's true. And I could maybe flesh that out by saying this. There's a guy named Stephen Covey that wrote a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And I was really struck by the second habit that he mentioned. And the second habit was this: he said, begin with the end in mind. And I thought about that, because you see, we're all terminal, and even though we try to ignore it, none of us gets out of this alive. And so I went to see Bob Devaney, who was the coach who hired me as a graduate assistant. And I worked for Bob as an assistant for 11 years, and then he became the athletic director. And he was the athletic director for another 18 years. So Bob and I were together almost 20 years or 30 years. And so I got a call from his son. He said, you better come and see Bob. He's in the hospital, and he's pulled out all the tubes. Bob was kind of a feisty guy, and he didn't want to live that way anymore. So I knew it was the last visit. And so it's kind of interesting because as we sat there and I thought about it, Bob had won almost every award you could win in football. We'd won a couple national championships. He'd been coach of the year, national coach of the year. He'd made some money, had a tremendous winning record, turned the program at Nebraska around. And yet, as we sat and talked in that last conversation, football never came up. Trophies, rings, watches, championships, those things that we chase after so hard, never were of any significance. And I thought, what is significant? Well, number one, his family was there, and in family it was important. It's kind of hard to die alone. And I think at the end of our lives, family will be important. And sometimes in coaching, it's easy to get so caught up in what you're doing that you ignore your family. Relationships are important. Our relationship, I know the fact that I was there was important to him. I think relationships with coaches and players we had dealt with were important. And I think at the end of your life, leaving a trail of broken relationships and shattered hopes and dreams would be something that most people would not want to face. And then I kind of took a chance. Bob wasn't formally a very, what you would call, religious person. And so I said, Bob, would it be okay if we said a prayer? And he nodded. And I remember a tear rolled down his cheek. And Bob was a pretty tough guy. And so I figured at the end, with most of us, maybe not all of us, the idea of what's on the other side was our relationship with God. At that point will be important. And so anyway, I'm quite devoted to FCA because it made a big change in my life. And really from that point on, I've not deviated. It doesn't mean I've been a perfect person since that time. Doesn't mean I have made mistakes, but it was the point at which I charted a course. And for me, that became true north. And so that has made a huge difference in my life.
Great, Coach. Another question here. What's one of the biggest challenges you faced as a coach, and how did your relationship with Christ help you navigate through that challenge?
Well, I guess any coach can say that you face a lot of challenges. For me, one of the big challenges was I followed Bob Devaney as a coach, and Bob had turned things around at Nebraska. Nebraska had gone through from 1940 to 1961. I think they'd only had 2 winning seasons, no championships. It had been a pretty bleak period. And Bob got here, and the first year I went to a bowl game, won a bowl game, and that was unheard of. Went 9-2, and then we won some conference championships, beat Oklahoma fairly regularly, and then we won a couple national championships. And then he, for some reason, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "I want you to take over." And at that time, I was 34 years old, and most of the coaches on the staff had been with him at Wyoming, and they were in their 40s and 50s, and here I was a young guy. And so I took over for Bob. And I think when you follow Bear Bryant or you follow Bob Devaney or Joe Paterno or whatever, people are always looking for that other coach, the guy that did all these great things. But you can't be that other guy. I mean, you've got to be yourself. And so trying to live up to what Bob had accomplished was probably the biggest challenge.
Right.
And along with that was a team called Oklahoma, because at that time Oklahoma was pretty good and very, very talented. And so the first 5 times out, we lost to Oklahoma. We had a couple really close games that we could have won, but we lost to Oklahoma, and that kind of became a 1-game season. You could win 10 games, but if you didn't beat Oklahoma, it was a bad year. And so I was kind of seen as a young upstart who just didn't measure up. And eventually we did get over the hump. We beat them a fair number of times. But that was probably the biggest challenge. And if Bob had not been the athletic director, I don't know if I would have survived. We won 9, 10, 11 games every year, but that wasn't good enough. And some of you coaches on the line are probably in those situations where there's a big tradition of winning at your school, and so the upside is pretty thin, and the downside is really great. And so some people are covetous and envious of those kind of jobs, but on the other hand, there goes it's somewhat hazardous too.
Well, Coach, if there's one thing you wish you knew as a young coach that you know now, what would that be?
Well, I think that this is kind of a progression that most coaches go through. I was on the college football playoff committee first couple of years, and it's always kind of interesting because we sat there, Barry Alvarez and I sat right next to each other, and then Condoleezza Rice was on the other side. And we looked at all kinds of data. We looked at strength of schedule, we looked at statistics, we looked at this and that. And when you looked at all of it, you probably figure, well, there's 12 or 15 teams out there that have enough talent, that have enough coaching, enough tradition to win it all at the end. I mean, it's a coin flip as to who ends up on top. But then generally speaking, things have begun to sort themselves out. And usually those 2 or 3 or 4 teams that ended up on top at the end were teams that had something else beside talent. They had a unique chemistry and cohesion. And I think as time goes on, I think most coaches come to realize that it isn't just X's and O's. It isn't just height, weight, and speed. There are other factors that go into that, which really make for one team beginning to excel over others. And so team chemistry and cohesion became really important. And that's something we worked at. I think I learned a little bit over time. I knew John Wooden, and John Wooden was a basketball coach. And I met with him on a couple occasions, and actually met with him when he was 99 years old, about 4 months before he passed away. And John always said this. He said, the most important thing in coaching is process. Nick Saban talks about process quite a bit. And I thought this is kind of interesting because John won more than any other basketball coach. He won 88 games in a row at one point. And that's pretty hard to do in basketball. And so he never talked about winning. And I thought, this is strange. And so I asked him a little bit more about it. He said, well, the first practice, what he did, he'd sit down and he would show his players how to put their socks on, so they didn't have wrinkles in their socks and get blisters. Pretty basic. And so he'd go on to show them how to pass and how to bend their knees on a free throw, and how to have a defensive stance and the fundamentals, and then on and on and that, and from there. And so, well, if it's good enough for John, it's good enough for me. And so I never mentioned winning to our players. I think sometimes a coach will say, there's a big game coming up and we got to play better than we've ever played before in our lives. If you think about that from a player's perspective, well, what do you do? I mean, this is something I've never done before. How am I supposed to play better than I ever have played before? But if you talk to them about carrying the ball high and tight, if you talk to them about keeping your head up when you tackle, if you talk to them about the fundamentals, they can do that. And so we set forth a series of goals. We looked at what it would take to be at the top of our conference, or the top of our country, statistically. So what we do, one goal would be, early in the season, we say 1 turnover or less. By the middle of the season, we say 0 turnovers. That's a major goal, because a turnover, as you know, is probably the biggest statistic in a football game. And on the other hand, we're going to get 3 defensively. And then we're going to say, well, what are we going to do those things? And we're going to average 6 yards per rush. And we're going to hold our opponent to 3 yards or less per rush. And what are we going to do in practice on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday? And so what I'm saying is we broke the game down. And so it's really the key thing is what you do on Monday and Tuesday. What do you emphasize? What do you do every day? What are the important things? What's the process that gets you from point A to point B? And so sometimes people emphasize the pregame or the halftime speech. And as you know, those guys, by that point, all they're interested in is getting out on that field and kicking the ball off. And what you say doesn't make a whole lot of difference. But what you say on Monday and what you practice on Monday and what you do on Tuesday and how thorough you are, and are you practicing the right things with enough intensity, and are you valuing the right things? That is the key to it. And so that's kind of what we did. And we emphasized the process. And a big part of that was the kicking game. Just a simple example. One of our goals was to hold our opponents inside the 22-yard line on returnable kickoffs. And we, on returnable kickoffs, would average to the 28-yard line. Say, well, that's kind of splitting hairs. That's only 6 yards. But if you have 10 kickoffs in a game, that's 60 yards. That's probably worth somewhere close to 6 points in a ball game. And so we broke it down. We had 12 offensive goals, 11 defensive goals, and 7 kicking goals that were critical. And those were points of emphasis all day, every day, on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And I never mentioned winning, because if you do the right things and you practice the right way with enough intensity, winning and losing takes care of itself. You don't have to talk about, you have to win this game, because so often that doesn't mean anything in concrete terms to a player.
That was really good, Coach. I just thinking about that, not sure how many coaches do that, where they do the things to get them winning. They just talk about winning a lot more, and we all need to hear that, be reminded wherever we are in a coaching career, that if we just talk about winning and don't do the things that help to get us to win, we're not going to get there. So great advice there, Coach. What's kind of along with that? What would you tell a young coach right now who's been coaching in college for a little while, but would like to become a head coach? What advice would you give to that coach who's looking maybe for it to make that another step from an assistant to head coach? What advice would you give that young coach?
Well, I think first of all, you have to perform, and you have to work at what you do. And so I suppose, I don't know this, but I think the reason Bob Devaney tapped me on the shoulder was I'd really worked hard in recruiting, and I'd really worked hard at film study, and eventually he made me the offensive coordinator. And so you have to work at what you do, and you have to show some results to the head coach. if you want to transfer from being a high school coach to college, you probably have to make some sacrifices. Some of the best coaches I had were guys who were high school coaches that I hired, and they had to come in as graduate assistants, which means they took a heck of a cut in pay, and there was no certainty, because what they had to do is they had to bank on the fact that one of the other assistants would get a head job somewhere, or a position would open up on our staff and they'd be able to move into that. But some of the very best coaches I had came through that route. Milt Teneber was an offensive line coach, was a great coach for us, was a high school coach. Frank Solich, who's now coaching at Ohio, became the head coach at Nebraska, was from that route. And so you have to be willing to take a chance and put your neck on the line for a period of time to make that jump. And some guys never do have a successful jump. You can do all the right things. So it's an iffy deal. There's always more people who want to be head coaches than there are head coaching jobs, for the most part.
Yeah. Well, Coach, as a follower of Christ and a coach and a football coach, is there any other wisdom you would want to impart to the coaches that are on this call? We got a few minutes here left. Just want to say, as a Christian coach, from a Christian perspective, is there any other wisdom you would like to give these coaches on this call?
Well, I think there's something called the principle of the 99 and the 1. And what that means is how the 1 is treated affects the 99. And so I remember one time I was playing with the 49ers when we were playing the Packers. And our coach got up and he said, you know, Jim Ringo, their center, was all pro center. He said, he's got a bad knee, but we really don't know which one it is. So we're going to, when he lines up to deep snap, we're going to put a guy on each shoulder. We're going to go after both knees. I remember in the game they did. I remember they carried Jim Ringo off on a stretcher. I remember how that impacted me. Jim Ringo wasn't on my team. I didn't know Jim Ringo personally. But I thought, you know, if that coach would do that to Jim Ringo, then when push comes to shove, he's not going to be worried about me or anybody else on this team. And so what that means is how the lowest guy on the scout team is treated, how the student manager is treated, how the secretary is treated, impacts everybody. Everybody on your team has worth. Every person on your team has value. Everybody has a part to play. And the more you can inculcate them with the idea that what they do is important and what they do is critical and that they are valued and they are appreciated. The fourth team guy is just as valuable as the first team guy in terms of his personal dignity, his personal worth. So there's a word in the Bible, agape, which is a word, it's a Greek word for love. And so I think the most important thing a coach can do is love his players in that sense, because agape simply means unconditional positive regard. I will the best for you. I want you to be everything that you're capable of becoming. And so I will serve you and I'll help you try to become that. And so something that goes with that is being positive, not calling people's name, not using profanity, and trying to be a good example, a good role model that people, to that person, to dealing with adversity. And, you know, usually people, when they deal with adversity, they'll quit or they'll blame. And the third way you can look at it is an opportunity. So you lose a big game. What do? Do you come unglued? You know, you take it out on your players, or you say, you know, we can learn something from this. We're going to work on this and this and this, and we're going to be a great team going forward. And so, if you can handle a tough situation and then put a positive spin on it, and immediately start looking at it through those eyes, that's the only constructive way you can do, because you can't go back and replay that game, but you can correct the things that did happen. And the best way to change human behavior is to catch somebody doing something right. You know, if a player makes a great tackle, you say, you know, this was a great tackle. You kept your head up, you locked your arms, you drove your feet. That's exactly what we're looking for. And in a healthy environment, whether it's a business or a football team, positive comments should outweigh negative by about 3-to-1 in a healthy environment. And so often we think of coaching as always criticizing or finding fault. And if you do that, I think you won't be quite as effective as you could be as if you try to handle things in a positive way and you love your players and they know that you love them.
Oh, great, Coach. We really appreciate that. And you're right. Love is the greatest motivator. We love because he first loved us, and God loved us so much, he sent his son to die on the cross for our sins. So that rings true for us as coaches too. Well, Coach, so grateful for your time today. I know all the coaches on this call, and we're going to recording this, and other coaches will get a chance to watch this. So we're very appreciative of your time and of your leadership in this great profession of coaching for all these years, and your example of a follower of Christ as a coach. So, Coach, thanks for being on this call with us today.
Well, thank you, Brian. And I'd like to thank all of you coaches who have tuned in. I want to wish you all the very best in your coaching career. And you guys are all in positions where you can make a huge difference in our country, and you're all very important people. So thank you very much.
Yeah. And for all those coaches on the call, just want to remind you, tomorrow, actually, we have another Heart of the Coach. Sean Watson, who Coach Osborne knows, is going to be our guest, who's now at Northern Iowa. Then on Monday, Robert Wimberly from Northern Illinois. Next Wednesday, Tim Horton from Vanderbilt. And then next Friday, Jeff Grimes, who's the OC at BYU. So hope you guys can be on those calls too. Again, Coach, thanks for your time today. God bless you and Nancy. Appreciate you.
Thank you very much, Brian.